Ever feel like you just want the shortcut, that, aha moment to understand something really complex?
Yeah, cut right through the noise.
Exactly. That's what we do here. Welcome to the deep dive. We take sources you send us and pull out the key insights, the useful stuff.
And today we're doing something pretty interesting, connecting physics, which sounds abstract to money, actual money or digital money.
Right. We had a listener point us towards this fascinating idea, looking at money like a physicist would, specifically using this concept called gauge freedom, and seeing what that tells us about how money works, maybe where it's going.
Yeah.
Especially, with crypto everywhere now.
And the sources are quite cool. We've got 2 papers from back in 2009 by a physicist, Dainis Zeps.
Okay.
And then a much newer one from 2025 where Zeps, actually with some AI help, looks back at his old ideas now that cryptocurrencies are a real thing.
So our mission, basically, is to see if this physics theory, cooked up before Bitcoin even existed, gives us a useful way to think about digital currencies today.
A different lens, maybe a shortcut to understanding some of this complex stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's dive in.
All right. So let's start with Zeps back in 2009. He's a physicist looking at economics. That alone is kind of an unusual perspective.
Definitely. And his big point, one of them anyway, in those early papers, was that money, well, what we can actually measure isn't the money itself sitting there. It's the change, the exchange. And he used this physics idea, gauge freedom, as an analogy.
Right. And the analogy he uses is pretty helpful. Think about sparrows on a high voltage power line.
Okay.
They're fine, right? They don't feel the electricity. What matters, what has an actual effect, is the difference in electrical potential, the change, not the absolute level.
I see. So the potential's there, but it's only felt when there's a change from one point to another.
Exactly. And Zeps is saying maybe money is like that. He felt that standard economics kind of missed this gauge freedom aspect.
And he thought if we really grasped this, if we saw money as something that only really exists when it's moving, changing hands, it could actually open the door to totally new economic systems. Like beyond capitalism, communism, socialism, something he called a new level of commonwealth.
Wow. Okay. That's a big claim. And he knew it sounded maybe a bit unrealistic. He acknowledges that.
Yeah, he does. But he seemed really convinced there was a fundamental reasonability to it, as he put it.
And remember the timing, 2009. The financial crisis is hitting hard.
Right. And Zeps actually wondered if that crisis, that whole meltdown, might force us towards this new idea, towards gauged money.
As an alternative to, well, his words were heaps of nominal dead money, basically money just sitting there not doing anything useful.
So he wasn't just talking about fiddling with interest rates or something. He thought we might need entirely new ways for money to even exist and operate to get this gauge freedom.
A fundamental rethink. And he even speculated about how you'd manage it, maybe some kind of supervising power.
Like a world government.
And maybe not necessarily government. He mentioned global parameters, maybe using technology. He joked about a monster robot. But the idea was some system giving feedback, guiding the process.
Okay, but wait. Couldn't you argue that, like, the stock market already does this, prices fluctuate constantly? Isn't that a kind of gauge freedom?
That's a fair point, and it comes up. Zeps sort of addressed it, though. He felt that what we see in markets is maybe a kind of forced or partial gauge freedom. He thought for the real benefits to show up, it needed to be maximized, maybe even total. The current ups and downs didn't quite capture what he envisioned.
He's also pretty critical of the credit system, right?
Yeah, he questioned basing everything on credit. He had this interesting thought that if you saw credit conditions changing rapidly, like both tightening and loosening significantly, that might be a sign that money really wants to work, that it's trying to flow and be exchanged.
And he took it even further, didn't he? Like, maybe we wouldn't even need money in the traditional sense.
Exactly. That was the really radical extension of the idea. If you have a fully gauged system, maybe the need for money as this intermediate thing disappears.
Replaced by what, though?
Well, he suggested new mechanisms for regulating the value of goods directly. Didn't fully spell it out, but it's a fundamental shift in thinking.
Which led him to call for a whole new science of values in Commonwealth. He felt the 2009 crash really showed we didn't understand value properly.
Especially how it impacts ordinary people, producers, consumers. And what about the wealthy and all the unsold stuff piling up?
He seemed to think the market system relies too much on well, greed.
He did. He argued that the real rules for a healthy commonwealth, like economic laws, should be discovered, like laws in physics, not just invented through policy.
It sounds almost like he wanted to reset economics. He even said something about casting out everything market-related.
Yeah, that was a pretty extreme suggestion, especially thinking about a total economic collapse scenario, like wipe the slate clean and find the basic principles again.
And he kept coming back to physics, didn't he? Like, the success of physics could be a model.
Right, specifically gauge symmetry in physics. He saw it as a potential pattern for how a commonwealth could function properly. His idea was, if we set up the right conditions, the commonwealth would respond according to these inherent rules.
So he's asking this really deep question. What does money, as we use it now, actually measure? What is its general value?
And he wonders if it relates to degrees of freedom, another physics term, kind of like how many ways can this thing called money actually move or change or be used in the economy?
It's fascinating stuff. He also had some interesting thoughts about scientists and greed.
Oh, yeah, that bit. He called scientists maybe the most loyal people and questioned why society often ends up run by those who seem more prone to greed.
He even joked about needing non-greedy detectors.
He did.
Yeah.
And he briefly touched on alternatives, focusing on people working for the common good, scientists, artists, altruistic types, even this idea of a religious-like approach in business where helping others could somehow collectively benefit the economy. Really wide-ranging.
Okay, so that's the foundation from 2009. Now let's jump to 2025. He's looking back, specifically at crypto.
Right. And the amazing thing is, his 2009 work was before Bitcoin. So any links he finds are, as he puts it, remarkably prescient.
So what connections did he see?
Well, he goes back to his core idea, money, as this relational and dynamic measure. And he sees that echoed in how value works in decentralized cryptocurrencies.
You mean because it's not set by a government or bank?
Exactly. The value kind of emerges from the network, from the consensus, the interactions between users.
The price swings we see in crypto.
Perfect example, he says, of a gauge-dependent perspective. The value isn't fixed. It's constantly being reevaluated by the network and the market. It depends on the context.
But he also thinks crypto hasn't fully lived up to this potential, right?
Yes, that's a key point in the 2025 paper. He says the actual development has only partially fulfilled the vision.
Why only partially?
Mostly because of things like huge amounts of speculation and also the rise of big centralized exchanges and platforms. They kind of dampen that pure, flexible, gauge-like nature he envisioned.
So the initial promise of decentralization, which really fits with his critique of greed-driven central systems.
Right, that alignment was strong initially. Crypto challenged the old way of creating and validating money.
But then speculation and hoarding took over, in many cases.
Yeah, he contrasts Bitcoin's original idea, peer-to-peer electronic cash, meant for exchange, with how it became largely seen as a speculative investment, something to hoard. That clashes with his idea of money existing through change.
It sounds like his old call for a science of values has echoes now in things like DeFi.
Definitely. He sees a connection there in the attempts to build programmable money and rethink financial rules from the ground up, using code and decentralized systems.
So the 2025 paper sort of lists the pros and cons, the hits and misses, compared to his 2009 vision.
Pretty much. On the plus side, the correlations, he points to crypto's dynamic value, the decentralization aspect, the peer-to-peer validation, and how these currencies gain meaning through use and circulation.
Okay. And the downsides. The contrasting developments.
That's where the speculation and accumulation come in very different from his ideal. Also, the return of simple profit maximization as the main goal for many participants.
And focusing too much on the tech itself, maybe, instead of the community value.
Exactly. The commodification of the technology rather than fostering those deeper communal value systems he talked about.
So, wrapping up that part, it seems like his early physics ideas really did anticipate some core concepts behind crypto, even if the reality turned out, well, messier.
That's a good way to put it. It provided some intellectual groundwork, a framework for thinking about it, even before it existed.
Okay, so let's try and pull this all together. What's the main takeaway from this deep dive into Zeps and gauge freedom?
I think the big takeaway is that this concept, gauge freedom from physics, offers a genuinely useful, if unconventional, lens for understanding money, especially cryptocurrencies. It helps explain their potential for being dynamic, decentralized systems of value.
Right. It gives us a different way to think about why decentralization or dynamic value might matter, based on this physics analogy.
Exactly. But, as we saw, the real world is complicated. while cryptos have shown some of that potential.
Decentralization, value emerging from use.
Yeah. They also run into major challenges. Speculation is huge. There's been a lot of, maybe ironically, re-centralization around big platforms and players.
So the practical evolution hasn't quite matched those pure theoretical ideals Zeps laid out back in 2009.
Not perfectly, no. There's definitely a gap.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a final thought to chew on. As digital currencies keep evolving, do you think the path they're on now really captures that gauge freedom Zeps envisioned? That idea of money existing primarily in its exchange, its flow?
Or is more change needed? Maybe a different kind of evolution to get towards systems that are more coherent, maybe more equitable than what we have now.
It really pushes you to think about what value fundamentally is, doesn't it? And how different systems, whether physics or economics, try to define and measure it.